We now have an opportunity to listen to the speech voted in the Desk, Times and Money Aid for 2016. And the subject is India's policy impact on industry and investment in the country.
Great. Thank you very much. So I want to start with a portrayal of how the international community sees India, how the Western intellectuals, how the economists, how the media, and how the fund managers look at India. This is an article from Financial Times in which Martin Wolf writes, India is a light in a gloomy world economy. He says, the ability of this huge and poor nation to sustain a lively democracy has been among the world's political wonders. By the way, Martin Wolf lived in New Delhi for many years as a part of the World Bank. So he's experienced about India. He says, India is now the world's fastest growing large economy. Let's look at a video next, which pretty much gives you the same information, but adds a bit more color.
India has surpassed China in terms of growth, and that's expected to continue. The IMF forecasting growth is 7.5% in India, while China is expected to slow at around 6%. But growth, not the only factor to consider. Unlike other emerging markets, India, net oil importer, which has helped bring inflation down. Plus, it has a strong demographic story. 50% of its population under the age of 25. That's expected to help boost its workforce. It's also being led by this guy right here, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who's seen as pro-business. Michelle?
Yeah, I hope this is India's time. We've been waiting so long, right, Seema? And if they could really be another billion people who could improve their standard of living if they get it right.
That's exactly right. And I think a lot of focus, again, on Prime Minister Modi, those reforms. There is a budget coming up in February where he will once again outline what he plans to do to kickstart growth, specifically on the infrastructure front. So that could likely be market moving.
Right. So a lot of good points to pick up from that. India is growing at a fabulous 7.5%. China is slowing down to 6.3%. Then we have Narendra Modi as the pro-business Prime Minister of India, demographic assets of the country, a very youthful population. So the question is all perfect in India now? Is India now on a path to economic and social growth? What, ladies and gentlemen, I want to do in the rest of my speech is to falsify everything you have seen and heard so far. India is not what is made out of it. Let's look at some primary school math. You don't really have to do complex spreadsheets or calculus to understand India. These are the numbers. Chinese population is actually quite comparable to the population of India. Chinese GDP is $12 trillion. Indian GDP is a mere $2.25 trillion. Chinese GDP is more than 5 times that of India. On a per capita basis, it is still more than 5 times because the populations are comparable. Chinese is $9,000 per year. Ladies and gentlemen, imagine living on $1,700 a year. And you can imagine what I'm talking about here. This is lower than what the average income, what the average GDP of Africa, were Africa a single country, would have been. This is a wretched, poor, abysmal country with disease and poverty. Let's, for the heck of it, look at the same numbers from a different perspective. Chinese GDP, if it grows by so-called very slow 6.3%, Chinese GDP will grow on a per capita basis, grow by $567 per person. At the so-called fabulous growth rate of India, Indian GDP will add just $128 per person. The reality is that in the international media, there's such a huge confusion between the concept of growth and growth rate. These are completely different concepts. For India to grow by the same US dollar as China is growing at, India needs to grow at 33%. I don't think anyone thinks that's possible. Now, just again, for the sake of it, to comprehend the magnitude of these numbers, imagine that China into the foreseeable future continues to grow at this so-called slow rate of only 6.3%, and that India grows at this so-called fabulous 7.5%. Imagine in your mind how many years it would take for India to start catching up with China. Simple spreadsheet exercise, simple calculator work. I'll give you 2 seconds to think about it. You don't have to respond to me. These are the numbers. It will take India more than 130 years to catch up with China. Primary school math has so far brought me here. India and China are not comparable. It makes absolutely no sense to compare the two countries. You are almost comparing the salary of a receptionist with the salary of a CEO. And India is not the next China, not for the next 130 years, even if all goes well with India. Right, so I'm going to go deeper in this conversation and to dish out the fundamentals behind what India is. Now, this is an interesting graph of the last 35 years. And you see something very interesting. India was a much more rich country than China was in early 80s. I was still a teenager those days. Remember, Indian population was much lower than Chinese population those days, and their GDPs were comparable. India was a very rich country compared to China. Something started to happen in the mid-80s. India was growing at the Hindu rate of growth, and China was starting to pick up its growth rate. And then, as time passed by, the second order growth rate of China started to pick up, and you see that exponential effect in the graph. The end result is that the Chinese GDP on a per capita basis is now more than 5 times that of India, despite that India started off richer. Now, the question is, in all these 35 years that I have been talking about, Western intellectuals, economists, Western leaders, international organizations like IMF and World Bank have asserted that India would be slow and steady, but eventually it would outsmart and outpace China. The reality, ladies and gentlemen, is that when you are completely and consistently wrong for 35 years, you must sit back and do some self-reflection. Let's do that self-reflection here. The reason Western intellectuals are so obsessed with India is because India follows the Western religion of democracy. It colors their lenses. It skews their understanding of reality. They fool themselves into assuming that does not exist. I don't have much time, but we can discuss democracy at great lengths. But you can hardly name a country outside the Western world that grew economically, socially, or culturally after it became a democracy. Democracy does not work in the emerging markets. If at all it works in the Western countries, it does not in my view. But of course, these Western intellectuals don't want to be repeating the mantra of democracy, democracy, democracy. So they rationalize why they think India should do better by claiming many other things in support of India. Let's address some of those. They claim that India has a very large English-speaking population, the largest outside the Western world. Very rapidly, things have changed. And India did have the largest English-speaking population. In the last 2 decades, and I'm sure all of you know someone from America, Canada, or England who is now teaching English in China. China imported literally tens of thousands of people, kids from these countries, to educate their people English. In the last 15 years, the number of Chinese who can speak English, from what I'm told based on the latest statistics, is now suddenly larger than that of Indians. And they speak better English because they have been taught by native English-speaking teachers. So that argument does not hold anymore. Demographics. Chinese population is stagnating. Old generation is increasing in numbers. The youth population is falling in numbers. China is in demographic decline. India. More than 50% of India's population is less than 25 years old. It's an extremely youthful population. Here's the problem, ladies and gentlemen. A vast majority of Indian students who pass out of the schooling system cannot write their own names. I'll give you a couple of seconds to absorb that, what I just said. They cannot write their own names. Indian engineers are unemployable. A vast number of them cannot spell the word engineering. I have seen examination papers of MBA students in India, and I won't go into details again because I don't have time for it. They could have been written by a primary school student, and you would have still failed that student. I spent some time in India and I spent some time in Canada. If I need a plumber or an electrician in India, I do the job myself. I would pay 50 times more money in Canada if I needed the same job done, but I get someone to come and do the job for me. The reality is, it's impossible to find someone who can do a proper job in India, even as a plumber or as an electrician. Rule of law. Now, this is a very proud thing for Indians, that they think that English left the rule of law in this country, in that country, the wretched, poor, diseased country of India. Rule of law and the common law traditions were left in India by the English. Now, I'm going to show you, I don't want to go into a lot of verbal details on defining the rule of law in India. I'll give you some visuals. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you visit India and if you decide to walk a few kilometers outside your 5-star hotel without your chauffeur-driven car, you will see something like this in India. I'm not even asking you to go to villages or smaller towns. This is called rule of law in India. And I promise you, you cannot miss sights like this if you have ever been to India. Okay, so this brings me to something very fundamental about India. Why the situation of India is so entrenched. Why education does not work. Why its institutions have deteriorated consistently over the last 70 years. And this is the key thing about India. India has been interacting with the West for the last 400 years. In the last 100 years, and particularly in the last 30 years, this interaction has gained massive speed because of internet and cheap telephony. Indians have imported Western music, Western movies, Western clothing. They have completely forgotten to import one thing: the concept of reason. Indians have no concept of reason. It's an extraordinarily irrational and superstitious society. In my view, this has...
Indians, you cannot generate.
Okay, listen,
I'm an Indian.
Kunal, you have to speak after me. Can you just let me complete myself?
You cannot generalize.
No,
Indians.
listen, I will let the organizers decide if this is all right.
Questions off. Yeah.
Okay? So if you could just hold it off for now. So, this is an extremely irrational and superstitious society, and the concept of reason has made no impact on that country. In my view, it has become worse, and it's becoming worse rapidly as we speak right now. Now, the problem is, ladies and gentlemen, if you do not have the concept of reason, you can have no moral instinct. Those people who grew up in a rational society do not understand this, but you have to think through this thing. If you don't have the concept of reason, you can have no moral instinct, because you have no capacity to differentiate between right and wrong. You cannot have the concept of compassion and empathy. Individuality, property rights cannot exist in such a society, and it does not exist in India. Let me give you some visual of what irrationality means. And this is a visual of the irrationality of Indians. If you go to India, this is the traffic consistently everywhere from Kashmir to the south of India. Everywhere, this is what you see in terms of traffic. You see cars parked in the middle of the road there. Now, the problem with this is that World Bank and IMF will tell you that India lacks infrastructure. See, there are roads there. The problem is not the roads. Problem is the irrationality of Indians. Indians, because they lack reason, cannot understand the left side of the road and the right side of the road. Now, you can throw $1 trillion in this society to train them to drive properly, and I guarantee you, you will fail. And American government and English government has learned trying to bring a change in Iraq and Syria. But anyway, I'm not here to talk about Syria and Iraq. The problem is that this country is deadlocked because of this thing. Now, the reality is that this is not just the visual of the Indian traffic. This is the visual of how Indian manufacturing sector works. When you go to a factory in India, this is what happens there. Utter and complete chaos. If you go to a service sector office in India, this is what you get. Utter chaos. Now, all good, you are thinking, India is a poor country, it's in a bad shape, but is it now changing? Now, ladies and gentlemen, you have to remember the concept of reason came into existence in Europe 2,500 years back. It took 2 millennia for this concept of reason to get infused into the Western society. This is not a simple educational process or just a few generational process. This is a millennia-long process. India is not becoming rational anytime soon. Okay, so is it changing? Indians are very proud that they have grown a lot in the last 30 years. A lot of countries have grown. A lot of emerging markets have grown in the last 30 years, synchronously together. And this was not because these countries liberalized or they did something great or anything special. The big key is that India managed to exploit, as with other emerging markets, cheap telephony and free internet that enabled massive transfer of technology from the West to India. And that was the biggest reason behind massive economic growth of India, which brought India to $1,700 a year GDP per capita. In my view, the low-hanging fruit have now been plucked, and India is starting to stagnate economically. World Bank and IMF will disagree with me. I'll mention a couple of things here to show my point of view here. The statistical method behind calculating GDP growth has been changed in India, which has pushed up Indian economic growth on paper by a couple of percentage points. But also, by far the biggest import of India is oil. And oil has fallen a lot, which has helped India in many ways. In my views, once this one-off benefit has been taken away, India must fall to its Hindu rate of growth. Can I just take 2 more minutes? And you can see in Indian exports, I talked about Chinese now speaking better English. Indian services sector is now migrating to Philippines, Vietnam, and China. IT industry and back office work. Exports have a negative trend in India. So let me just conclude with 2 more slides on Modi, the new Prime Minister. In his reign, India has become extremely fanatic. Hindu fanaticism has grown rapidly in the country. Nationalism has grown by leaps and bounds in that country. This morning, the puppet Supreme Court of India took a decision that every cinema hall where they play movies must play the national anthem and everyone must stand for it. That's the scope of nationalism. If you don't do this, you get beaten up and taken to the police station. Modi is a dictator. He was the same person who was behind alleged killings of thousands of Muslims and rapes of thousands of Muslim women in 2002. The reason why English and American government banned him from entering their countries. Let me just show you 2 visuals and I'm finished with it. This is a bunch of Hindu fanatics beating up a Muslim, which is now a regular news in everyday newspaper in India. Hindu fanatics beating up Muslims for no reason actually, killing, hanging them, brutalizing them, raping Muslim women. And finally, Modi came up with a strange idea of demonetizing 88% of monetary value in circulation 3 weeks back. This is the scene you see across the country as I speak now. The country is in chaos. Ladies and gentlemen, remember one thing. Among these desperate and soulless people, can you imagine that this country can ever emerge out of corruption, which Modi claims to be fighting against? Look at these desperate people. Old people, disabled people, and women haven't a chance in getting into these so-called lineups. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. We've been clearly disabused of our preconceptions.